Does the Bible really teach that you shouldn't get tattoos? On the surface, it appears that way, but is there more to it? Is there more here than meets the eye? If you enjoy a good mystery, stick with me, because we're going to solve this once and for all. The verse that many point to is Leviticus chapter 19 verse 28 from the Old Testament, and it does appear to say that people who follow God cannot get tattoos. It seems pretty straightforward. Most people would stop investigating here. But you're not most people, are you? A critical question to ask is this: was a tattoo in ancient times the same thing as a tattoo today? Now you're thinking like a detective. So let's check that out. Let's trace the origin of tattoos backwards and see if we find any clues. The word tattoo means to strike or mark the skin. The Smithsonian notes that in Egypt, there's evidence of women sporting tattoos as far back as 4000 BC. Even some of the pharaohs had tattoos. Here's a picture of a tattoo on a mummy's hand on display in Peru. It dates to between 1350 and 900 BC. The markings sure look similar to a modern tattoo. Another question we can ask then is, well, why were tattoos banned in the Old Testament? What did they mean? Did they mean the same thing back then as they mean today? Maybe we can find the answer to this in the Bible, so let's look for clues. Looking again at Leviticus 19:28, we see that in the same sentence that forbids tattoos, it says, "You shall not make any gashes in your flesh." That seems a bit odd. I mean, tattoo needling doesn't create a gash in the flesh, so what's going on here? It also says, don't make gashes for the dead. What is that? And why does the verse end with the statement, "I am the Lord"? What does that have to do with getting a tattoo? Something is kind of fishy here. Something is missing. We seem to be missing some context or background information. So I think what we need to do next is consult a scholar who's an expert on ancient culture. This Cultural Background Study Bible has a footnote on this verse. It says that ancient people used to gash their flesh and create lacerations when they were mourning. There's another ancient religious text from one of Israel's neighbors called the Baal cycle. You might recognize Baal from the Bible or the game Diablo 3 on Xbox 360. Baal was an evil god, and in the Baal cycle, Baal was killed. When the chief god El found out Baal had been killed, he started mourning. He took a stone and he cut his own skin. He took a razor and he cut his cheeks and he cut his chin. He plowed his own chest like a garden. The self-mutilation was supposed to express the magnitude of the loss he was experiencing, the magnitude of his sorrow. Why is this mourning practice referenced in the same sentence as tattoos? There's no clear connection at first, until we start looking at what ancient tattoos meant. And here's a clue. Some Egyptian tattoos displayed the name of gods, but why? People living in this area believed the gods had created humans to be their slaves. This is unlike the story in the Bible where God created humans to be kings or rulers of the earth and to be in a special relationship with him, a family. But people from other cultures believed the gods were sick of working their own land and sick of growing their own food. So what they did was create humans as slaves. Humans would barter with the gods by making sacrifices, hoping the gods would be appeased and bless them with good crops and fertility. And here's where the tattoo comes in. In this area of the world, a tattoo was a slave marking. It showed who your owner was. So a person would get a tattoo to show that they were a slave of a particular god or sometimes a person. Tattoos in nearby Mesopotamia were also slave markings. If a slave belonged to another human, his master's name would be inscribed on his hand. Or a priest might get a tattoo to show that he served a specific pagan god. It's probably no coincidence that when the tattoo ban in Leviticus was written, God's followers had just escaped slavery in Egypt. They had been there enslaved for 400 years in the territory of pagan gods, rival gods. They had experienced during this time slavery both physically and spiritually. Maybe we can figure out the context of a tattoo by examining the other surrounding verses. It's a dangerous practice to isolate a Bible verse to determine its meaning. So let's see what the rest of this section has to say, and maybe that can help us figure out what a tattoo meant to the author of this Bible passage. Notice how the verse on tattoos comes right after a verse that says, "You shall not round off the hair on your temples or mar the edges of your beard." What is the connection between a haircut and tattoos? Good question. There are two common links: slavery both to humans and hostile gods. In Mesopotamia, a slave was required to be marked by shaving off half of the hair on his head. There was also an ancient practice of shaving off a lock of hair and offering it to the gods to keep the gods happy. The picture is starting to become clearer. In this time period, both tattoos and the shaving off of hair were signs of slavery to a person or a god. That could be why the verse banning tattoos ends by saying, "I am the Lord," as if God were saying, "Hey, you're no longer slaves to these other gods. You're part of my family now." It could be that God only wanted them to show loyalty to Him, and these other practices were associated with loyalty to pagan gods. But there's another clue in the verse that follows. A ban on making your daughter into a prostitute? That seems unrelated at first. But back then, pagan temples had prostitutes, and some of the scholars argue that in some cultures, prostitutes wore tattoos so men would know that these women were prostitutes and might carry diseases. Or maybe they're wrong and it was just another sign that this woman was a slave to this pagan god in this temple. There's even a nearby verse that bans eating anything with its blood in verse 26. Why is this here? It also doesn't seem related at first, but if we dive into the ancient context, there were a lot of ancient blood rituals connected to pagan worship. After some detective work and examining the context, we discovered that pretty much everything in this section was associated with pagan worship or enslavement to a pagan god or person. So, does the verse in Leviticus really mean that I can't get a tattoo? I've always wanted a Zelda Triforce tattoo right on my hand. Can I get that? I guess the question to ask is, why are you getting a tattoo? Is it a mark of slavery that you belong to another deity? Make no mistake, the writers of the Bible believed in evil spiritual beings, fallen angels like Satan. These rival gods weren't necessarily human inventions to them. It's a little unclear in the Bible, but some pagan gods may have been thought of as other fallen angels like Satan.
Could it be Satan?
They did have a belief that there were different angels assigned over the nations. Some of those angels were believed to have rebelled and corrupted the people living in the nations they watched over. Are these the pagan gods that were being worshipped in Egypt? I don't know. Nobody knows. It's a mystery. But it is one way that Old Testament people may have viewed these gods. It's no coincidence then that in Numbers chapter 33 verse 4, the biblical writer wrote, "They marched out defiantly in full view of the Egyptians, who were burying all their firstborn, whom the Lord had struck down among them, for the Lord had brought judgment on their gods." I don't know about you, but I don't know anybody who got their tattoo as a sign of slavery to another god or human, and most tattoos are not an attempt at self-harm. I do have a friend who has a very large tattoo of an angel killing a demon on his chest. Pretty cool. But the original biblical context for the meaning of tattoos was eventually lost, and by the 4th century, a new interpretation emerged and became the primary traditional view. And here it is. Modern Christianity sometimes forbids tattoos based on this reasoning. They believe that a tattoo disfigures the body that was made in God's image. But that's not the reason for the ban in Leviticus. This interpretation is newer. This belief can be traced back to the 4th century AD, when Emperor Constantine, banned tattoos. Before you put too much stock in Constantine's interpretation, consider this. He may have lacked the tools and the cultural background we discussed to interpret Leviticus as it was originally intended to be understood. While Jesus' first followers came from a Jewish background, the first generation of the early Christian church, by the 2nd century, the church was mostly comprised of people from other cultures who didn't know the Jewish background. The Bible calls these people who are not Jewish Gentiles. And they saw the world through a different cultural lens. And because of that, new interpretations began to emerge that may not have matched the original meaning of these scriptures. For example, Constantine seems to have understood the concept of being made in the image of God literally, as if being made in the image of God meant that we're made to physically look like God. But this was likely not the original meaning of the image of God. A more accurate understanding of being made in God's image is related to not physical appearance, but it's more of how we live. It's being made to represent God on the earth. How you live your life, how you treat others. We're God's ambassadors on earth to other people. Being made in the image of God is related to our purpose, to connect others to God so that they would see us and they would understand God. So if being made in the image of God doesn't mean we were made to physically look like God, is Constantine's interpretation true to the original intent of this verse? You've just learned a really important skill. Asking the question, what does this verse mean to you, might actually be dangerous unless we first ask another question. What did this verse mean to the writer? And to the people it was originally written to. So, does the Bible really ban tattoos? Well, my perspective is this. It only bans a certain kind of tattoo. It comes down to your intent. If you're just tattooing, say, a butterfly or a saying that you like or the name of someone you want to remember, to me, that doesn't really seem like what the Bible is talking about when it bans tattoos in Leviticus chapter 19. At the end of the day, it's not my interpretation that matters, it's what God meant, and we're all just trying to figure that out together. So take the evidence we've uncovered through this investigation and weigh it yourself. So, did you find the evidence we talked about compelling? What do you think? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this and found it helpful, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and we will investigate another tricky Bible topic soon.